There's a specific kind of person who, in the same afternoon, can fix their parents' Wi-Fi router and explain to a 22-year-old what it felt like to wait 3 weeks for a letter back from someone you had a crush on. That person is not a Gen Xer, not really a millennial either. They exist somewhere in between, and for a long time, psychology had no name for them. But here's the thing that makes this actually interesting. That in-between space, it didn't just give this group a quirky identity, it literally rewired the way their brains handle change, uncertainty, and connection. And the research behind it is genuinely fascinating. We're talking about Xennials, people born roughly between 1976 and 1985. And today we're going to unpack what psychology has to say about why this group is wired the way they are. If you're new here and this kind of deep dive is your thing, hit subscribe. It genuinely helps. The term Xennial started circulating seriously around 2014. Some sociologists prefer to call it a microgeneration, which is basically a cohort so specific that it doesn't fit cleanly into the broader generational buckets we're used to. And that specificity matters, because most generational categories are a bit lazy, honestly. Slapping 35 years of births into one label, like the millennial bracket does, glosses over the fact that a person born in 1982 and a person born in 1997 had radically different childhoods. Different enough that lumping them together for psychological analysis tells us almost nothing useful. Xennials, though, the window is tight. 1976 to 1985, and what happened inside that window is the whole point. If you were born in this range, your childhood was completely, stubbornly analog. You didn't Google things. You either already knew or you walked to the library and spent 45 minutes in the reference section, and sometimes you still left without a clear answer. That was just life. Plans were made in advance and then kept because there was no way to text someone that you were running late. You showed up or you didn't, and if you didn't, your friend just stood there for 20 minutes before eventually going home. Phone calls happened on a single shared landline that the entire house used. If you wanted to talk to someone privately, you either stretched the cord into the bathroom or you waited. There was no such thing as, "I'll just message them later." Later didn't really exist in the same way. Boredom, genuinely the kind where there is nothing to do, was a regular feature of childhood. And that boredom wasn't a problem to be solved, it was just Tuesday afternoon. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. Xennials didn't ease into the digital world as children. They hit their late teens and early 20s, and the entire landscape changed around them almost overnight. The internet went from a novelty to infrastructure. Mobile phones went from a luxury to something everyone had. Social media appeared and then expanded at a pace that still kind of boggles the mind. And this timing, right at the edge of adulthood, is crucial. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain most responsible for adapting to new environments and building complex skills, doesn't fully mature until around age 25. Research published in Nature Neuroscience confirmed this timeline, which means that when the digital revolution hit, Xennials were still in what neuroscientists call a high plasticity window. Their brains were still genuinely flexible. They were old enough to have a firm grip on the analog world, to have internalized it, to know what it felt like to function without constant connectivity, but young enough that adapting to the new paradigm didn't feel threatening. It just felt like learning something new. That combination, analog experience plus neurological readiness for digital adoption, produced something kind of rare. Researchers have started using the term cultural bilingualism to describe what this created, and once you hear it, it makes perfect sense. A true bilingual doesn't just know 2 languages. They can shift between them naturally, without effort, without translation lag. They understand the logic of each one from the inside. Xennials did something similar with technology and communication. They didn't learn digital life as adults learning a second language in a classroom. They absorbed it during a developmentally elastic period. But they also didn't grow up inside it the way younger millennials or Gen Z did, where it's simply the only reality they've ever known. The result is this. They can be fully present in a face-to-face conversation without the low-level pull of a phone in their pocket, and they can also pick up new software, a new platform, a new tool, without the anxiety that sometimes grips older generations when technology changes. They hold both at the same time without it being a contradiction. Here's one that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. Xennials grew up in a world where embarrassing moments just faded. That disastrous haircut in 7th grade, the awkward phase, the things said at parties that everyone quietly agreed to forget, none of it was photographed in high definition and uploaded somewhere permanently. Memory, when it's left to its own devices, is actually pretty merciful. Research on autobiographical memory shows that the brain naturally softens the edges of painful experiences over time. Details blur, narratives shift. The embarrassing becomes the funny. It's a healthy psychological process. When everything is documented, permanently, searchably, permanently, that process gets complicated. People now carry a kind of external archive of their past that their brain can't edit the way it naturally would. Xennials, almost by accident, got to experience the older way of relating to their own history. Their past can breathe. It can evolve into the version of the story they tell at dinner parties rather than staying frozen exactly as it happened, forever accessible. That's not a small thing psychologically. It's a fundamentally different relationship with identity and self-narrative. There's a complication here that the cozy nostalgia of Xennial identity tends to skip over. A large portion of this group entered the workforce or was mid-career buildup right around 2008, the financial crisis, the kind of economic disruption that doesn't just inconvenience people, it restructures how they think about stability for the rest of their lives. The research on this is fairly consistent. Financial hardship during early career formation has effects that persist long after the situation improves. It shapes risk tolerance. It shapes how people relate to institutions, to savings, to the idea that hard work reliably produces security. That trust, once broken at exactly the wrong developmental moment, doesn't fully come back. So here's this group that learned to be genuinely adaptable technologically, socially, culturally, but sitting under that adaptability is often a quieter, more anxious current, what if the floor disappears again kind of energy that most people in this cohort couldn't necessarily name but absolutely recognize when someone describes it. Resilient on the surface, quietly braced for impact underneath. That's a specific psychological combination, and it's worth understanding rather than just labeling. What makes Xennials genuinely interesting to study psychologically is that they carry contradictions that most people would find uncomfortable, and they carry them pretty naturally. They're independent in the old-fashioned sense. Many grew up in an era before intensive parental supervision was standard. Hours would go by without a parent knowing exactly where they were, and that was normal. You figured things out. You got hurt sometimes. You dealt with it. That kind of self-reliance gets built into you early. But they also came to age right when the internet was still idealistic, when connectivity felt like pure possibility, before the complications became undeniable. So they have this genuine optimism about what technology can do, sitting alongside the skepticism of someone who remembers what came before it. Analog but digital. Independent but collaborative, skeptical but hopeful. Most people experience internal contradiction as tension, something to resolve. Xennials tend to experience it as just the texture of things, and that tolerance for paradox is actually a psychological asset in environments that keep changing. This is worth sitting with for a moment. Something was genuinely lost in the transition to always-on connectivity, the ability to be unreachable for a while. Not as a strategy, not as a digital detox, but just as the default state of being a person in the world, that's gone for most people now. The particular quality of attention that comes from having nothing else competing for it. The patience that develops naturally when waiting is just part of life. Xennials remember these things not as abstract ideals, but as lived experience. They know what they feel like from the inside. At the same time, they gained things they'd never want to give up. The ability to find anyone, learn anything, stay connected across distances in ways that used to be impossible. They don't romanticize the past the way a fully analog generation might, because they also genuinely appreciate what came after it. They can hold both, the loss and the gain, without needing to decide that one cancels out the other. If any of this landed for you, the contradictions, the in-betweenness, the sense of straddling two very different worlds, that's not a quirk of your personality. It's the psychological fingerprint of a specific moment in history that you happen to live through at exactly the right, or depending on the day, the wrong time. And honestly, in a world where the ground keeps shifting, having already survived a complete transformation of reality might be one of the more useful things a person can have on their resume. Drop a comment and tell me which part of this actually resonated with you. The analog childhood, the 2008 thing, the memory piece? I'm genuinely curious whether the experience looks different depending on which end of that 1976 to 1985 window you were born on. I'll see you in the next one.